In this video, we'll be looking at creating a tenancy for a client. When we have a client in the system and a vacant property, we allocate the client to the property by creating a tenancy. We can do this either from the waiting list screen or the client screen, and in this example, we'll use the client screen. We click Clients in the toolbar and search for the client we'll be creating the tenancy for, in this case, Neil Finn. We double-click this row to open his client screen and click the Create Tenancy button at the top of the screen here. If our client is already a tenant, this function will say View Tenancy. Now we see an empty tenancy screen for Neil Finn, and we need to record 3 separate pieces of information before we activate this tenancy, which are: which room will we house our tenant into, how much will our tenant be charged in rent and other charges each week, and what is the first day we'll be charging rent for the room or property. Once we have this information, the first thing we need to do is select the room our client will be tenanted into. We click the Select Room button and the Vacant Room pop-up box appears. This box is divided into 2 sections. At the top, we can see the rooms that are vacant untenantable, and these are the rooms that can't have a tenancy for a number of reasons. At the bottom, we have the vacant rooms, and we can select a room here to tenant Neil into. If we have lots of rooms to choose from, we can use the filter box at the bottom here to filter this list to the property we're after by typing a few letters to shorten our list. Once we've found the room we're after, we click it to highlight it and then click the Update button. We can now see that the property details have been populated on the left, and the middle section of the screen changes to show us the rent record for the room. Usually, when we create a tenancy for someone in a room, unless it is a new room, there will be existing rent records in here, because this section records a history of the rent that has been previously charged for this particular room. Here we can see a previous rent record from a past tenant with a start date but no end date. So the first thing we need to do is close off the previous rent record by adding an end date. When we enter an end date to close the previous rent record off, we need to enter any date before the new tenancy starts, so we'll enter 30th of April 2018. Once we close the rent record, we get a warning message to advise us that there is no current rent record for this room. And we know this because we've just closed the old record off, so we click OK, and now we enter Neil's rent record. To do this, we go to the row with the star or asterisk on the left-hand side and add a start date. Once we click in the start date field and begin to type, we see that the star changes to a pencil, which means we've begun to create the new record. So we put in the start date as the first day we're charging rent for this room. This is the same as the tenancy start date, so we'll enter 1st of May 2018. When we're entering the rent record, we also skip past the end date of the current record, even if we know when this tenancy will end. We need to leave the end date blank because we're not guaranteed to know when this tenancy is going to end, or if there will be a rent increase, and if so, when that increase will occur. Next is the rent column, and this is where we key in how much rent we'll be charging our tenant every week. We can charge rent fortnightly in Chintaro, but we must key this in here as a weekly figure, so we'll be charging Neil $150 a week for this room, and we key it in here. We can also see that there are 4 other columns here: furniture charge, management charge, garden charge, and utilities charge. These column headings are examples of charges that are not rent, but are charges that the client will be charged alongside their rent each week. Your Chintaro system administrator can change the names of these columns to suit your organisation, but for the moment, let's assume that we're going to charge Neil a utilities charge of $5 per week, so we key in $5 and leave these others blank. We will enter the market rent for the room in the last column, and the market rent for this room is $230. If we don't key in the market rent, a warning message will appear. When we click on any of the boxes below this, we see that the latest fortnightly rent figure has now changed to $300 per fortnight, and this figure doesn't factor in other charges. It will only show the rent charge per fortnight. Next, we need to check the tenancy start date. The tenancy start date is the first date that we'll be charging rent for this room, and this is the 1st of May 2018. The date here will default to today's date, so if we're creating a tenancy for a date previous to today, we need to ensure that we change this date. After changing the tenancy start date, we click elsewhere on the screen and notice that the rent charged to date defaults to the day before the tenancy start date. This should always be the case. We never want to try to change the rent charged to date, and we'll see why this is later when we have a look at generating rent. Once we activate the tenancy, we won't want to be changing the tenancy start date, so it's very important that we double check that the date is correct before we activate the tenancy. The actual start date field is where we put the actual start date of the tenancy. If we've recently started using Chintaro, but our client has had a tenancy for some time, we put their actual start date in this field. We don't need to enter the actual start date if this is a brand new tenancy. Most of the other fields here are greyed out, meaning we can't enter data yet. But once we've selected the room, edited the rent record and checked or changed the tenancy start date, we will have enough information to activate this tenancy. Activating the tenancy is one of the few times in Chintaro where you actually have to click Activate to save something. If we were to exit out of the tenancy screen before activating, we see that Chintaro warns us that the record will not be saved because we did not activate the tenancy. This message is just a warning to make sure we either do or do not want to exit the record without saving, so we'll click No to remove this message, then click Activate. Once we've activated, we can see that a few things have happened. First, we can see at the top that this is an active tenancy. The general information section is now able to be populated with information, and any alerts, tags, and notes come through from the client screen. Back in the general section, we see the tenancy start date and rent charge to dates are now locked, and we're unable to change them. We can now fill in the rest of the general information, starting with the payment book ID. The payment book ID is a field where we can put in a unique identification number for those tenancies that pay their rent via a bank deposit. If Neil was paying his rent by bank deposit, we would enter a payment book ID here, so the reference he gives to the bank to make his payments will link up with the payment book ID we have in Chintaro. If the tenants are paying by work and incomes, we don't need to use the payment book ID field because their social security number is their unique identifier, and this is kept on the client screen. If we're using the payment book ID field, each tenant must have a different payment book ID, and there can only ever be one instance of each payment book ID. The transfer tick box is used if a tenant has transferred from one room to another within your organisation. This is a brand new tenancy, so we'll leave this unticked. We tick the IRRS box if our tenant has an income-related rent subsidy. The payment type field indicates how the payments for the tenancy will usually be paid, and this will default to work and incomes. Change this by dropping the list down and selecting the tenant's usual payment type if the default is not correct. The subsidy tick box is only used for transitional housing, and it must be ticked if this applies to this tenancy. We can enter an expected exit date for our tenant if they are expecting to stay with us for a short period of time, and this is useful for determining when we expect vacancies in our rooms. In this example, that is not the case, so we'll leave the field blank. The next four fields are date fields, such as the last inspection and next inspection fields, which allow us to keep track of when we'll be inspecting this property for this particular tenancy. Last rent review and next rent review tell us when rent reviews are due. We'll leave the inspection dates as we'll be looking at these in another video, but we'll enter the next rent review date as 6 months from now. The Tenancy Manager field is a drop-down list, and this is the person or organisation who are responsible for looking after this tenancy. And because we've entered a property manager for the property, their name defaults through here. If this is incorrect or blank, we can use the drop-down list to select the appropriate manager. We also enter the program the tenancy is in, and Neil is in our crisis housing program, so we'll select crisis housing from the list. Skip past both the band and equity percentage fields, as these are for Australian users only. The leaving reason, exit point, exit outcome, and number of bedrooms exited to will be populated when we vacate the tenancy, so we skip past them. The induction complete and signed agreement tick boxes are used for an Australian report, so we can skip past them as well. Finally, we can put any general comments in the comments section here. In the middle section of the tenancy screen, we have the tenancy transactions or ledger, which will display all the financial transactions between ourselves and the tenant. We currently only have an opening balance of 0, and we will explain this section in detail in a later video. On the right-hand side of the screen, we see our alerts and tags section, which have come through from the client screen. If we have alerts that are applied to more than one tenant in the household, all alerts for household members will appear here with their name next to the tag to identify who they're for. The alerts and tags will always appear here, as it's important that we see them throughout Chintaro. We also see the sections for arrears actions, related links, and notes, which, like the tags and alerts, have come through from the client screen. And we have the blue buttons at the top of the screen that perform additional functions for the tenancy, all of which we'll look at in later videos.